Thank you, everyone, for joining. This session will be recorded and available for view afterwards. We would ask that you ask questions at the end of the presentation. You will be able to ask questions in the chat box, and then my colleague Danielle will read out your question. So thank you for joining. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Gemma Wood. I'm the Monitoring, Evaluation and Knowledge Manager at the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women. And for those of you who don't know us, the UN Trust Fund was established in 1996 by the UN General Assembly resolution, and we're the only global grant-making mechanism dedicated to ending violence against women. We've been around about 20 years and awarded over $139 million to 493 initiatives across 139 countries. And every year we have a call for proposals where we welcome civil society organizations to apply for grants focused on prevention of violence. And every year we get over 1,000 applications. And these applications are to tackle violence around the world, all forms of violence, and they're often focused on prevention of violence through social norm change. So why have we called this webinar? Well, over the years, as we said, 20 years, we've been funding many organizations, and a number of them are the members of the Community for Understanding Scale Up, who you hear from today. And they have decades of experience in working on social norms change. And we think it's highly important that we hear from their experience. And more we're receiving applications citing evidence from the members of this community, from civil society organizations wishing and governments wishing to test, adapt, and scale up their methodologies. Likewise, we've seen more interest from the UN, and UN Women included, to scale up some of these methodologies. So it's vital that we hear from the originators of these initiatives. As an example, last year we had over 25 different applications citing one methodology, the SASA methodology for raising voices. And we were pleased we're funding 4 organizations at the moment to adapt or replicate SASA. So as I said, we're here to hear from them, the members, and in particular we want this to inform our appraisals of upcoming applications in the system. We also are committed to some of the lessons that you'll hear about today. Key messages from CUSP so far have been, for example, to encourage donors and funders to move away from short-term projects to longer-term projects. We at the Trust Fund have tried to address this by adding what we call our invitation-only window for our portfolio, where we aim to identify organizations with potential for scale-up and fund those projects for up to 5 to 6 years. And we were pleased to be able to fund Raising Voices, one of the organizations you'll hear from today, who adapted the SASA methodology across 3 additional sites. And we really saw the potential and promise for that, for learning on what can work on ending violence. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Laurie McCall from Raising Voices to introduce the panel and get on quickly with the presentation. And I would ask if people can make sure that they're muted. We will be muting you as you come in, but as a reminder, if you can make sure your microphones are on mute. So thank you, and we'll pass over to Laurie.
Thanks so much, Gemma, and thanks everybody for joining. It's really wonderful to see so many names of known colleagues and friends, and also a lot of new people. So thanks so much for joining us today, and really thanks to UNTF and the team there for hosting the Community for Understanding Scale Up. This is a group that I've had the pleasure to work with really over the last 2 years. And it's a fabulous group. And so I just wanted to do some quick introductions so you know who the members of CUSP are on the call. Not all members of CUSP are on the call, but there's a good number of us. So first we have Diane Gillespie. She's a professor at the University of Washington and a very long-time collaborator of Tostan in Senegal. There's also Tina Musuya, who's the Executive Director of the Center for Domestic Violence Prevention in Kampala, Uganda. There's Alice Wellborn, who's the founding director of Salamander Trust, and many of you would know that she is also the author of Stepping Stones. I think on the call is also Ellen Baenza. She's also with Salamander Trust. She's the coordinator for Africa. We also have Angelica Pino. She's the programs director at Sonke Gender Justice. And last but not least, the fearless CUSP coordinator, who is Leah Goldman, and she's a senior program officer at Raising Voices and really helping us to hold this group together. So we are going to share some experiences today, and Diane, Tina, and Alice are going to take you through different parts of the presentation, and then all of us are going to be online for a discussion, and then there'll be a Q&A section after the discussion. So thanks, everybody, and Diane, I will turn over to you.
Hello, good morning, everybody. We are really honored to be invited to work with you to advance social norms change initiatives for gender equality to prevent violence against women and girls. You can change the slide. You can, yeah. So just briefly, who we are. We're 9 organizations. Raising Voices does the program SASA. Salamander Trust does the program Stepping Stones. The Center for Domestic Violence Prevention does the program SASA. Oxfam does the program We Can. Sonke Gender Justice does One Man Can. Puentos does Puentos. 7 Image, the Intervention with Microfinance for AIDS and Gender Equity does Image. The Institute for Reproductive Health at Georgetown does Great. And Tostan does the Community Empowerment Program. Our organizations have been and are being scaled in a lot of different ways. We're often mentioned in best practice roundups. As mentioned by Gemma earlier, donors have recommended and some donors have prescribed them in their funding calls. They're being used by many other groups in both positive and problematic ways. Next slide, please. We came together to share concerns and challenges we were facing, as well as just excitement about working together. As we began to work together, we realized we had a lot in common, and we began to collectively analyze our experiences. Again, as we worked to them, we developed a commitment to synthesize and share lessons learned related to ethical and effective scale-up practice. Next slide, please. So just to frame a little bit our discussion today, by scale-up, we mean deliberate efforts to increase the impact of innovations successfully tested in pilot or experimental projects so as to benefit more people and to foster policy and program development on a lasting basis. By social norms, we're talking about the unspoken behavioral rules shared by people in a given society or group. They define what is considered normal and appropriate behavior for that group. And we emphasize that social norms are special as we think about gender violence because they're often invisible. Next slide, please. So we've worked with 6 different types of scaling. All of us have been involved in horizontal scales, that is graphical expansion, either through program replication or various adaptations. SASA and GREAT have been involved in vertical scale-up, that is institutionalization via organizational policies and budgets. SASA, Tostan, and Stepping Stones have all done grafting. They've added components to existing initiatives. Tostan and Image are probably the best examples of the original designers implementing work directly in new regions. SASA and Stepping Stones have done additive partnerships. Their original implementers help scale with new partners. And finally, multiplicative, new implementers take on the work that is probably best represented by SASA and Stepping Stones. Next slide, please. So there are these 5 dimensions we found to social norm scaling. As many of you know who have been working with social norms, diffusion is really central, and it can be either organized, planned, or spontaneous. And diffusion is central because the change in behavior has to spread from the inside out, from a committed community out to other communities. And so the result has to be that the structure is bottom up. That is, the social norm change has to be driven from the bottom up in a decentralized way, as opposed to a top-down way. The implementation needs to be flexible and adaptive because each context has novelty, and so one just can't take a standard program and sort of put it on top of a community. It really has to be, the community really has to work with that. The pace has to be phased and gradual. This is because social norms because of that invisibility I talked about, they have to be discussed, they have to be brought to light. People need time to think and talk about them. They need to practice new behaviors. They need to integrate new thinking into their ways of being. And so often it takes time, especially at the beginning. And then over time, as more and more people come on board and a community or an area reaches a tipping point, the change can become more rapid. And finally, the leadership has to be participatory. It has to emerge from the community, and that leadership often needs maybe special training. It has to be available. And that's because people who are leading from within a community are better able to listen to local demand. That's often in contrast to expert or donor-driven leadership. So those are some of the just general overviews of our work together. And now for our insights, I'll turn it over to Tina and to the next slide.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. We are really excited to be part of this discussion. I'm going to be giving you insights from CUSP. We've been doing this work for a very long time, and just as Diane and Lori said, we have a case study collection that identifies key elements of success, highlights challenges, and also provides recommendations for adapting and scaling our methodologies. And more broadly, social norms change interventions. Next slide. So the first insight is prioritize accountability to communities. Accountability requires community insights and substantive community involvement in planning, implementing, and monitoring social norms change programs. This definitely means that the communities have to be well prepared, just as Diane was saying. They have to be trained and grounded into the approach itself so that they are able to contextualize the approach to their own setting, and then also prepare themselves, just as Diane was saying. The change begins with them before they can take it out. Now, because our resources are open, some people have taken on the approaches without and missing this component. For example, Stepping Stones has an example whereby there was pressure and limited funding the groups that took on this approach were not well prepared to implement these stepping stones. So what they had was inadequate training. Maybe they had half training, I would say. When they went to, they hadn't transformed enough because they were still, questioning their own beliefs and practices. When they went to the community, they did what was easier for them, which was reinforcing what they knew about female subordination, rather than working in a more transformative way or giving ideas that are challenging the norms and the inequality. So this experience really showed us that if the implementing partners don't prioritize accountability to the community, the programming could be more harmful than beneficial. Next slide, please. The second insight is it's very, very important to fully understand the principles of the approach and align it with the values of the methodology. Organizations have their own principles and value systems and their own setup. Now, these approaches that we have, and picking an example from Raising Voices and FEDOVIP, our approach of SASA, it talks more deeply about power. It unpacks power and also enables people to reflect on how they're using their power, even within the institution. Now, that can be scary for certain organizations who have a different value system. Where we have found that this has been successful is where the leadership is willing and more open to reflect on power and discuss power inequalities, even within their own institution, to enable them be at that point where they can take it out and challenge the inequality. So organizations that are working to change social norms need to be more about promoting equality and human rights embodied in social justice programming. So it has to really align with their own, or they have to lead the talk. Next. The third insight is maintaining fidelity to the structure of the original methodology. All these approaches have core essentials that define what the programming looks like. And therefore, they've brought a lot of promise and evidence that if you follow these given models, you'll be effecting change out there. But these models are still cognizant that there are different contexts. And therefore, if you're scaling or adapting this, you have to be aware of the core components of each of these models. What we have found sometimes, and because, as I say, these models are mainly open source sources that people can pick, some people have, maybe with good intention, thought that they are making hybrid or making summaries of what the models are. They've decided to collect very many activities and summarize maybe in a few months. And then they say, we've shortened the program. And they think they are being more effective or meeting the times that they have. Now, with our own experience, we found that some of these programs who thought that it's a mere collection of activities, because remember, many organizations think that they are going to sensitize communities, not to transform or not to do community mobilization. So some of these have really summarized the programs that have not been effective at all. For example, Tostan had an experience where some of the people took their model and just shortened it in a very short while without keeping to the fidelity of the model. And of course, that was harmful programming. And that's one of the reasons that Tostan decided to keep their curriculum, because remember, people are taking this without checking in with the originators of the program, because we do not want to feel responsible for harmful programming out there. Next. The fourth insight is ensure adequate time and funding. All these programs are working to address deeply entrenched norms, beliefs, and behaviors. And that requires that there is enough preparation. And preparation means understanding your community, training your core team that is going to implement, and also realigning your plan and program to what is going to effect change in that given community. Now, sometimes this has not been the approach that many donors use. Many donors always have short project kind of funding cycles that are mainly about, can you do this within this given short time? And then they are more about measurement driven rather than long-term initiatives. Now, this is we do understand where the donors come from, but if you're working to transform the social norms, there are challenges that you need to look at here. Because if you're being driven by finishing and spending of the money, there are certain important aspects of the programming that are mainly successful that you're ignoring. For example, Image had an experience where they were still in the preparation process of training their core team, trying to get the communities that work, that this program would be more successful at. And the donor felt that they were delaying, so they took away the funding, and Image was left without. Now, this brings a lot of challenges to the implementers and then to the communities themselves, because that means if we are running after the short-term funding and the limited time frames, people are going to go to the communities to work when they are ill-prepared, and they may cause harm rather than effect the changes that we are trying to achieve. Next, please. Next slide. The fifth insight is involve originators. So all of us within this CUSP have had our programs come to where they are because we took a lot of time in innovating and creating and making sure aligning it to what we know transforms the community. Now, our approaches have been effective in many ways, and many organizations, when they're writing their proposals or their program designs, have referenced many of our approaches here without necessarily understanding what it takes to do this work, what are the do's and don'ts, and how able are they to do it. So often it has been in call of proposals and it has gone viral. Like, for example, Stepping Stones has been in almost all continents. And the work has been going on in different ways without the originators. Now, the challenge that comes with this, it's not that we are being protective about the models, but the issue is the people are taking it on without being prepared, and they are deviating from the cause of the approach. And by the time they realize that they are off track, sometimes they get back to the originators when it's too late to rectify the program or even the report. And then because of this, donors have, the funding cycles have not even been including a budget to include the innovators of these programs to be able to support this kind of work, because it's about learning, unlearning, and relearning, and also being ready to do this work. What we found that works is when donors, implementers, researchers, and other stakeholders work with the program originators and with the community. This will be a win-win situation because everyone will be moving at the same pace and supporting each other along the way. Next. The sixth insight is about re-examining the role of government and international NGOs in effective and ethical scaling. Out there is always the call of scale and sustainability. And because many of these models were developed to civil society organizations, sometimes they do not have the structure across broadly. They've been in limited spaces. However, we've had some recommendations where the recommendation has been take it to scale and government or international NGOs are best suited because they have a big reach. Now that would be good, but the issue at hand here is some of these institutions, their value system and their structure of work is not directly aligned to this social justice work. And the manner in which they do the work may not be transformative enough. For example, there's the great case study, which was a very good program working in northern Uganda. They chose to work through the government system, and many of the NGOs were not directly involved because this was the priority of the donors. Much of the program was really useful. Right now, it's not being replicated because who can you hold accountable to replicate this? It's very hard to find who is the best suited partner to take this to scale. And then again, if the competence and the capacity is gone, because most government structures, for example, and many international NGOs, there's high turnover of staff and then quick change in priorities. Many of the organizations, the human rights organizations or civil society organizations, are focused on a given goal, maybe preventing violence, and they will stay, that's their priority for a very long time, even though they may change strategies a bit. Now with GREAT, this was not possible, and therefore re-examining who is the best fit to work with is very, very important. And even finding ways in which how to take this to scale without working with partners who maybe their intention is to maintain the status quo. Next slide. So quick takeaways in summary. There are only 6 for you to remember. The first one is prioritize accountability to communities. Second is fully understand the principles and align with the values of the methodology. Third is ensure adequate time and funding for programming. Fourth is maintain fidelity to the elements of the original model. Fifth, involve originators. And the last one is re-examine the role of government and international organizations in effective and ethical scaling. Thank you.
Both done a fabulous job, so I don't have much to say. But we thought that we would open up the conversation a little bit for some of the considerations, which we will have a chance to talk about in a few minutes. If I could please just go on to the next slide first, I'll come back to that. And just to reassure everybody that all of these slides are going to be shared afterwards. So you will all be able to see what's on them all. So just to share with you other further reading which you may want to go back to. As already mentioned, we have these case studies and all of them are available at the link at the bottom of this slide. We also have our original policy brief, which we presented at the SVRI meeting in Rio last September, and that was the first time we came together publicly as a group to share what we had. And the reason why we decided to do the case studies after that was because we were putting together some of these points in that SVRI policy brief, and people said, yes, we get it, we understand your concerns, but surely this is obvious anyway. And we realized that people hadn't actually perhaps quite understood sufficiently because we hadn't explained some of the complexities and the challenges that we have faced. So the case studies are really fleshing out some of those complexities more specifically. And then that on the cusp, the politics and prospects reference there, that's just come out in the SRHM journal, and that is available now online, open access for anybody to read. And we also have a blog on the SVRI website, so that's Sexual Violence Research Institute website, which you can read as well if you'd like. Could we go on to the next slide, please? So if any of you want to make contact with any of us, there are our organization and program and contact names and emails. Amy Bank isn't on that list at present because she's currently taking a break from CUSP. a much-deserved break. But if any of you want to contact Amy and Puntos de Encuentro, please do contact perhaps Leah, if that's okay, Leah, and Leah could put you in touch directly with Amy. So if we could please just go back to that consideration slide, I'd like to suggest that we perhaps leave that one up on the screen as we move into the question and answer session, which we're going to have next, I think. So here we put together some of the thoughts which have emerged from the work that we've been doing together over the past couple of years. So some thoughts around planning. Is there demand from community to implement the process? Who's deciding if and or where to implement? How are communities' safety and voices included? So you see the idea of really putting the community first and thinking about how are we connecting with the community, and whether sufficient time and funding is there really to think about meaningful engagement of community members and real development and monitoring and evaluation of the process of engagement with the community, as well as support for technical assistance of originators, and particularly in terms of the trainers. So we have values there as well about whether the original principles and the values which initiated our work are really there or not. And then going back to the facilitators, we feel that facilitators are so crucial. The community and the facilitators, sadly so often in short-term results-driven projects, often community members and facilitators tend to get forgotten about in the rush to complete the results. And often, sadly, facilitators get taken on short-term. As the others were explaining, they get very little training or inadequate training. They get thrown into being expected to deliver really quite complex processes, which they often haven't had time to work out in their own lives. And then often that's the end of their contract, and they get sort of thrown out. And so, you know, those who have got fantastic skills and insights, nothing happens further. So it often feels as if they're being used as commodities rather than really being treasured and valued as fundamental building blocks for capacity. So we'd really like to see how we can find ways of really respecting the facilitators and the trainers as well as community members, in really understanding that in terms of ethical and effective approaches and sustainable approaches, we really need to build and invest in and respect facilitators and trainers and support them to develop their own national and regional networks, because that's where the real insights lie. That's where the connections are with what is really happening from lived experience in communities and countries. And then last but not least, the fidelity again, because so often we've found, sadly, that a lot of our programs, organizations, it's been a little bit like a pick and mix sweet shop, that organizations have maybe taken one exercise from here, one session from there, and throw them together. And actually, you know, so much work and effort has gone into really thinking deeply about how each program is woven together. And, you know, we may all like different genres of music, but, you know, throwing together the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, you can tell what age I am. Throwing together the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Beach Boys and trying to create one song out of all of them isn't quite going to be the same effect. So even though we all have very common values and principles, and this is what has been such a joy to work as a part of this group, each of our own programs does have its own particular story to tell and narrative to tell. And so that's where the fidelity issue really comes in. So I think perhaps I'll leave it there and hand back to you, Gemma. Is that right?
Yes, thank you so much, Alice, Tina, Laurie, Diana. That was a fantastic presentation, so clear, so succinct, lots of food for thought, and it's so powerful that you've all come together to put down these messages, but in such an, you know, a digestible format. I would like to now pass over immediately. I have lots of questions. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions in the room. But we have online, well, we have over 80 people online, which is fantastic. But online, we have a couple of organizations that the UN Trust Fund is currently funding to adapt, implement one of the methodologies mentioned. So I would like to turn to perhaps Wangache. I'm sorry if I've pronounced your name wrong. Wangache, the Executive Director of Center for Rights for Educational Awareness in Kenya. I just want to see if you have any insights from your experience in Kenya where you have been ethically and effectively adapting or implementing SASA, and any reflections on the presentation.
Thank you so much, Gemma. Greetings from Nairobi, and I'm very, very delighted to join this conversation. I think from the presentation from Tina from Uganda, I think resonates with the work that we do. CRU has been a partner of Raising Voices we did the first implementation of our work in Nairobi. And from what she has presented in terms of ensuring that there is funding to support the work, for me that resonates a lot, because SASA work cannot be done with a short-term funding. So we got a partner who was able to work with us for a period of 4 years. And I can report here that as a result of that, we're using the SASA model to prevent violence against women. We were able to significantly be able to reduce cases of violence against women in one of the slums in Nairobi, but also to be able to join the work of prevention and response was done together. So again, even as you do prevention, is important to response. And for me also, the other thing that as a result of this work, now working with UN Trust Fund, we've been able to, and this is the work that we're doing, to be able to move our work from Nairobi and be able to, again, using the SASA model to test it in other communities that are pastorally. So we are very, very excited to see what are the kind of results that we're going to get from an area that is communities that are totally different from Nairobi. One other important thing is I think the partnership we had with Raising Voices to be able to train our staff members, to be able to set in a reflection session for the staff, for the community activists that we are working with, just to be able to see is the program still achieving the kind of results that we had planned for, what are the challenges, where do we learn, where do we unlearn. So we had someone come all the way from Uganda just to be able to sit with our team members and have a lot of conversation going on. I think also I found it very, very helpful that we had an open conversation with Raising Voices in terms of where do we think we are going right, where do we feel we have challenge, where do we need more support. So even before we would have the review meetings, we would be able to organize virtual meetings just to be able to touch base and see where the work is going. I think for me also is the shared values between the two organizations, Raising Voices and CRU, because we had a common understanding that as much as we're doing work, for a long time CRU had done work around response. It was about time to get upstream and really focus on prevention. So can I stop there for the time being?
That was fun. Thank you very much. That was very helpful insights. And I'm going to now pass over to Sarah, if you're online, Sarah Siebert from Beyond Borders, who's also adapting SASA in Haiti. Do you have any comments?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, hi, everyone. I really appreciated that presentation. So Beyond Borders and Haiti adapted SASA from 2010 to 2015 for Haitian culture and context, and has been actually functioning as a hub of technical support with Raising Voices connection throughout since that time. And just recently, through the UNTF project, have been integrating a module to address violence against women and girls with disabilities into the SASA adaptation for Haiti. And then we'll be scaling that up to our technical support partners throughout Haiti. And just to say that the principles that have been expressed in this presentation, or the insights, have been really, really spot on in our experience. Even when we're trying to figure out and broker things for some of our technical support partners, there's been quite a lot of pressure to do it in a more traditional way that isn't necessarily faithful to the methodologies themselves. And that pressure isn't necessarily always coming from the organizations. It's coming from potential donors of those smaller organizations. And just to say that one of the challenges that we've had with our own technical support partners, which tend to be really nicely placed to go in with some of these insights, the prioritizing of accountability to communities, and we're able to help them with the technical support to ensure fidelity, and all of those pieces have been respected, and yet it's been really hard to identify funding streams of entities that are understanding those insights and principles and are willing to interact with grassroots local organizations that are quite connected with communities. So just to kind of add a challenge of scale for a lot of this, and at the same time also just to appreciate kind of all that's been said here by by CUSP, and to appreciate that I think when these principles and these insights are respected, there's just such incredible work that can happen in communities, and it's such a really beneficial way to scale these types of methodologies.
Thank you so much. And so now I'm going to start opening up for questions from the crowd. But just to start, for myself, reflecting on what Sarah and Wankache said, and our work with Raising Voices as a grant making mechanism, it's been quite clear how we can work with Raising Voices. So it's just maybe a question for Diane and Tina and other members of CUSP. It's quite clear to us now from working with Raising Voices that Raising Voices have the hope of signing adaptation agreements and MOUs with the organizations who want to adapt to SASA, that you are aiming to have regional learning hubs. So I wondered what mechanisms, as you say, you left at the end of your slide the contact details for your organizations, but do you have any other thoughts or recommendations on how donors, implementing partners, can contact the other originators? Bearing in mind, we also don't want to raise expectations that you can give the level of support that perhaps Raising Voices can do. So any thoughts on that would be gratefully received. That's the first question from me. Perhaps, I don't know whether Tina or Diane want to address that, or Laurie, who would like to address that. And then while you're addressing that, we'll start asking if anyone has any questions. You can start using the chat box. And please write your question in the chat box, and then my colleague Danielle will call on you we'll try and unmute you. I think it seems quite clear. So we'll try and unmute you to ask your question, but please put your message in the chat box. Okay, I'll pass back over to Laurie. Who should we ask?
That's okay. We're trying to organize who will take some questions on
Thank
WhatsApp,
you.
so hopefully that will help. I think, Alice, did you want to speak a little bit about what it means, like how people could get in touch and the kind of support that some CUSP members can give?
Sure. So I'm really sorry, everybody, because my colleague Ellen is on the call but isn't actually able to access her audio. Otherwise, you'd be hearing from Ellen and not from me again here. So apologies, everybody, but Ellen is challenged with rural internet access. So in terms of connecting with us, I mean, we are delighted to connect with organizations wanting to make use of the material, and are all too keen to. I mean, we have an adaptation guideline on the website. We have lots of we have an international community of practice, and on purpose, when we first set up Stepping Stones, it was we had multiple donors, and the whole idea was this for to be an open access material or for a very limited cost, so that we could share and share alike around the world. And a lot of organizations have done that, but sadly other organizations haven't. And I mean, this isn't just about stepping stones. I think this applies to all of us, although I think Dan's going to talk about Tostan in a minute. You know, the whole issue around the challenge of investing in the originators and, you know, as I was saying earlier, in the trainers, I think it is huge, because it's so easy for an organization to pick up a program and not actually really to understand why things have been done in a certain way, or why other things haven't been done. And, you know, we have the huge benefit of global experience to draw on. You know, we're all only too happy to share that global experience with organizations, but they do need to connect with us so that we can do so. So, you know, this is the ongoing challenge, and, you know, obviously these sorts of ongoing connections and building that shared experience does need sustained funding and support. So, you know, this is an ongoing challenge, and what we have been saying here, anybody can say, but that's obvious, it's not rocket science. And that's the whole point. It absolutely isn't about rocket science. But sadly, you know, in this day and age when everybody's budgets are so tight and when time frames are so limited, unfortunately, it's these basic principles and values which are the first to suffer, and, you know, that lack of investment in trainers, in shared understanding, is sadly what's suffering. I don't know if Diane wanted to add something about Tostan's particular context.
Scaling, one of the ways Tostan has dealt with scaling is to develop a training center, and we're working with organizations, we hope primarily across Africa, but obviously organizations from the north as well. And we're really using the training center as a kind of laboratory to look at ways in which Tostan can partner with organizations like Girls Not Brides to facilitate their work in communities using the kind of Tostan community-led development principles. Tostan's curriculum is extensive, and so not everybody can replicate replicate the 3-year community empowerment program, but we're trying to look at ways we can extract from that curriculum key parts that might be useful to people in their work. And the person, Godfrey, in the contact is organizing trainings, so he would be a good person to contact in Tostan, or feel free to contact me as well.
Thanks, Diane. And Diane, I think you were going to take the question from Catherine in the chat box. It's the question around how are these considerations different than kind of regular programming? And I know this is a discussion we actually often have, Catherine, in CUSP. Like, are we really talking about scale, or are we just talking about good programming? So I think, Diane, you were going to address that one.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought the question was about community spoilers.
Oh, sure.
It is? Okay.
I mean, that's a different one, but if you wanted to address that quickly.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I must have gotten the name wrong, because that's a really important question. And it has to do with how you go into a community. And again, I would say what Tostan is a learning organization, and it's really learned a lot about the entry point into a community and the ways in which one has to be very transparent with leaders that already exist in the community. They've also developed what they call a community management committee. Some of the people in that committee are not in the classes that Tostan offers. So there's a partnership with people both experiencing the Tostan curriculum and sort of existing in the community at large. So I would say if you bring on board early on already influential leaders in the community who are very clear about what the work will be in the program that's being implemented, this has really fostered a kind of win-win situation. And so now what Tostan's doing as a result of this really preliminary work in the community is they're training religious leaders in human rights before the program is implemented. And all of that has an effect on resistance, and there is resistance, by the way, has an effect on the resistance that is actually addressed by the community itself instead of the organization. So I hope that's helpful, the sort of preparatory work that needs to go into the implementation process.
Thanks so much, Diane. Tina, did you want to add anything onto Diane's answer to Reem's question around power structures in the community?
Hey, Laurie, I just have a few minutes. Sorry, just to interrupt. If you don't mind, we'll just read the questions aloud.
Sure thing.
Before you address them, just because everyone can see the chat. Or if you don't mind, or if it's quicker, Laurie, if you read the question aloud.
Sure. So Reem has asked, on the point that Tina made in regard to open discussions on power and power structures, how have you dealt with spoilers in the community that do not want their power structures to be threatened?
So for us, in our case, with the SASA model, we use the power language, which is, just as Diane was saying, that's part of the preparation of the implementers. The power language, of course, it's about the power within, power over, power to, and power with. This helps the people to connect deeply with the issue at hand. In this case, the whole issue of violence against women. And it's also about the activism component. It's really getting people to understand that this is a social justice problem. Each of them has a responsibility to do something, however small it is. And then they also see the benefits of the nonviolence. And most importantly about the training is also equipping them with the necessary skills to get to the community, to spark critical thinking and reflection for the community and the power structures to start questioning what they are finding as injustice and harmful. So if you do not train the people to connect with the issue, they will go out there and tell people to stop the violence or to tell them that the way in which they are behaving is bad. You're going to be kicked out of that community because you don't tell adults how to live their lives. But if you get them to get into a critical thinking process and questioning what they've already known, it's about getting them uncomfortable about the status quo. That's what this methodology is about. And getting them to think of the other side, what is it that they need to do and how do you do it? So for us, that's how we get the people to address this. And that's why we are saying it's very important to have adequate time, because this cannot be achieved in a very short time. And it's good to give people time to internalize the new learning and even try it out. And that's why we also have to be there to provide technical support along the way to refocus the program.
Thanks so much, Tina. And I'll ask Leah, you to take the question from Catherine, which is, it seems the issues mentioned on the checklist or considerations are very similar to what we should be considering in regular programming. Is there a significant difference we need to consider between general programming and specific scaling?
Thanks, Lori. And I think you briefly mentioned on this earlier that we're having the same discussions at CUSP, trying to distinguish what does it look like to take these methodologies at scale and how much do they differ from them in their original in their original form. So I think the point here is that when going to scale, organizations, funders, UN agencies are more likely to task scaling to larger, more bureaucratic organizations and implementers who can do this. So they're more likely to fall under these common pitfalls that we see in programming. So I think that there are a lot of similarities between scale and programming, but the idea is that we can't do a shortcut to changing social norms, and that's just a fact. We see so many people wanting to use less resources and shorten programming, but these things take time. So whether it's even possible to fully scale these methodologies is definitely a question that we've considered. What are the implications of this, and is it possible to achieve it at the kind of level that a lot of donors and other stakeholders expect us to take it to? And I think one piece of the case studies too is thinking that putting something at scale in the traditional way of cutting resources and cutting programming, you're not going to get the same results that you had when you did it in its original form. Like the RCTs or the evidence that we have for some of the CUSP methodologies, you're not going to get the same transformative results if you try to take shortcuts. It's a process, and it should be respected and hopefully aligned with some of these considerations. And maybe it means that scaling these methodologies looks like how you do them at programming level.
Thanks, Leah. And there's more information around that debate actually in the journal article that Alice mentioned in the PowerPoint. So we'll be sending everyone the PowerPoint as well. So Angelica, I'm going to go to you for the question from Susanna, and she's asking, from the experience of these cases, which role is the state playing? Public policies at national, regional, or local government?
Okay, thanks so much, Angelica Pino Fonke. And I'll tell you a bit about our experience in South Africa with the South African government. Of course, it has been very difficult with the one-man campaign or intervention. The first thing is, of course, they want a lot of people to be reached with little resources, and they want as much as they can in the very short term. We have been trying to get funds to put our program into national budgets, and it's been extremely difficult. We have been in negotiations for a long time with the key departments, so it all depends on who you have in those departments, whether they understand the importance of the intervention and all the resources you need for it. So it has been a bit difficult, but I think also the key problem with if you know a bit about the work of Sonke Gender Justice and the one man can is engagement voice for gender equality. Also, there is a very, very little understanding of how the intervention works with feminist principles. We really try to work with feminist principles. So there is a very kind of patriarchal understanding at times of what is this type of work, what does that entail. And we have had some type of intervention from government when it becomes extremely patriarchal, where they have men as protectors, for instance, not as a partnership in change. So there is a very limited understanding of the intervention. It happens also with donors, but with the government particularly. So they really like the kind of the role model aspect of the intervention and all this kind of how they can use that sometimes for political gains even, to kind of inflate the role of certain political leaders in government. So that has been very problematic for us, I would say. So it's the issue of the numbers and the issue of how they understand the intervention. And we understand we need to occupy certain spaces in the political arena, but it is very problematic at times. And we have had some experiences, not very good experiences with the big national commissions tackling HIV and AIDS, for instance. I also want to just comment a bit on the humanitarian experience. Someone also asked about in the humanitarian context. Just to say, there are also good experiences of working with the organizations doing this work. Not everything is bad. We have had a very good experience with Concern Worldwide, the Irish international organization. We have been working with them on the strategy in the continent, in Africa particularly, and one country in Asia. And the way they have done the work is very slowly trying to work. We develop the intervention together. We have a specific manual adapted from our work. But also they said, we want to go internally first. We're going to work with our staff. We need to really promote change among our staff, which is another key principle of CUSP, by the way. The people implementing need to understand this. So now we must start moving to more a community type of intervention. And you know, concern works a lot in humanitarian settings. So really, I think I appreciate very much the way they have engaged into adapting the intervention. So that's from me, quickly.
Thank you so much. And if I can just add on the humanitarian question from Borum, it's, you know, the learning that we found in more stable settings is really applicable to the humanitarian setting as well. I think one of the things that we really learned, we've been, many partners have been using SASA in humanitarian settings, and as Gemma mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we've just finished a 3-year project to learn about adaptation, and one of those contexts was the humanitarian setting in Dadaab, refugee camp in northern Kenya. And, you know, I think just as Angelica is saying, like, we can do these approaches within humanitarian spaces. It just requires, you know, really careful adaptation, kind of just like it does in any context, but maybe perhaps especially so in humanitarian contexts. So really, you know, building out time for the adaptation process to really understand the dynamics in the community. There's different safety issues. There's all sorts of issues that need to be considered in humanitarian settings. But, you know, just like many of the other social norm change work, we have to really figure out if it's a moment within a crisis to do prevention work, or as Wangeshi was saying, you know, do we really need at some moments to focus on services and really address people's immediate needs. Dadaab is a refugee camp, like many across the world, unfortunately, that people have lived there for extended periods of time, often, you know, sometimes for generations. And so that's a very different environment than perhaps an immediate crisis situation. And so, you know, there is some guidance, for example, from Raising Voices in a program brief around what adaptation and how to think about adaptation of social norm change work and SASA for humanitarian contexts. And I can certainly put a link in the chat box. But that's a really important issue. And again, as we all just keep emphasizing, this work can be done. And like, think about it as a field that now we're saying that actually we can really change dynamics around key critical issues around gender inequality within project timeframes. Like, that's amazing, right? Like, we should feel so good about that as a field. And I think one of the main issues around CUSP is that, you know, we want to make sure that those gains are not lost by doing now, like, imagining wanting to do it even quicker. Like, you know, if we're thinking about project time frames, 3, 4, 5 years for a program to make real deep sustained change in the community, that's amazing that that can happen. And let's not just to jump on a bandwagon to go big and big and big, is to forget that that's a huge gain. And if we do programming well, it can be really deep and sustained. So just a little point about that. And I think I'm going to head over to Tina for the question on fidelity from Angelina. And the question is, with regard to fidelity to the model, what actions have been useful in helping organizations remain true to the implementation model?
I think that's a very good question. One thing that we all have in common is where whoever is interested in using any of these models immediately gets in touch with the originators of the models. The reason we say this is any of the members here will be able to help you deeply understand what the model is about, what it takes to do it, and therefore they will guide you in how to use it within your own program design, your budgeting, for example, and then also to know how to even negotiate with your donors about time and resources, and given your own capacity to know how far you can go with this. Part of this is we have some guidance on how, all the models here, guidance on how to stick to the fidelity of the model, because we clearly write out what the essential components of the models are. And then there's also the component of technical support that you will need from any of the originators. during your own implementation of the programming, even scale up or adaptation. So all this is available, and not to forget is being in touch with us, and for us to be able to provide technical support also means that you also have to budget for that kind of support, because yes, we may want to do it, but we are unable to travel to your country or to your organization or to pay for our staff time. So it's very, very important to be in touch with the originators of the models to really give you all this guidance, and also maybe help speak with your donors about what is required to take on these models in a very effective manner.
Thanks, Tina. So I think, Gemma, those are the questions from the chat. I don't know if UNTF or any other participants have any other questions that they wanted to ask.
Thank you. Yes, I'm going to pass over to the room. I think we have a question. Hi, everyone. Nice to hear you. This is Dina from the Ending Violence Against Women section at UN Women. And I just want to tell you that we, in every space that we can, are reinforcing these messages on your behalf because we understand how critically important this is. I wanted to ask whether you've had opportunity to present these findings and your experiences to donors. And I know that there are a number of donors at various levels that fund this work, but it might be something important to do, and to get those who possibly understand it better, like DFID, I would imagine, to be a champion or a voice on your behalf with others.
Thanks so much, Dina. And yes, we've been talking a lot actually with donors, and the reception has been really positive. For example, last week or 2 weeks ago now, there was a high-level policy meeting in the UK with the FID and very many other donors. And Rebecca Lundgren, who's a member of CUSP, and Tina and I represented CUSP at that meeting and spoke about some of these issues to scale. We've also been inputting into the new DFID guidelines on scale for social norm change work. And so, and that was the impetus too for writing the journal article, that sometimes gray literature doesn't get picked up in the same way as journal articles do. And so we've been trying to reach different audiences in that way as well. So it's a really good question, and thanks for promoting it. You know, that's the big idea about CUSP, is that if we all get around these, we know these ideas, right, as Alice was saying, and sometimes in the rush of it all, in the rush of putting together a proposal and trying to get programming done, we forget, or we just let things slide and think they aren't important. But again, if all of us show up at the table in all sorts of different spaces, say, actually, this is what's really needed for quality programming and ethical programming and safe programming for women, our voices are a lot more stronger when they're together. And I wanted to just, Gemma, if it's okay, Alice had a point that she wanted to make on the humanitarian context. So can I pass over to her?
Yes, of course. Okay,
great. Alice, go ahead, please.
Oh, thanks, Laurie. Well, it's really building on what Laurie was saying. It's you know, with Stepping Stones also, you know, we've heard reports, very moving and inspiring reports over the years from different humanitarian contexts, whether it was Mozambique or Angola or Liberia or, you know, other countries, or DRC, for instance. You know, and the core thing about our programs is that, you know, it's about communications, it's about relationships, it's about, in particular in a humanitarian context, of course, where things have fallen apart, it's actually trying to piece them together again and to rebuild that trust in communities that is so often completely blown apart by war or natural calamities. And you know, I think that's what our programs are about. They're about, you know, putting the soul back into connectivity and to supporting. You know, you were asking about how to support, you know, how to deal with community members who are spoilers. Well, you know, as Tina said, it's supporting them to feel listened to and to enable them to understand that actually, if they have the opportunity through these programs to put their own feet into others' shoes in the communities, that they can understand for themselves through their own experiential learning and insights what it feels like to be a young woman or a young man or an older, anybody in that community other than themselves. And it's that basically slowly, step by step, building those connections, whether it's in humanitarian settings or in more, I can't think of the right word, in more relaxed settings, in less stressed settings. But one way or another, it's about relationships. And I think that also is something which so often we have sadly found, in the rush for results, particularly, for instance, thinking about working with girls and young women, we've often seen that our program has basically been reduced to just working with girls and, even testing girls for HIV to see whether they can join the program or not, or, partner notification of women. If they have HIV, you've got to bring your partner along, he's got to be tested too. And all of these are, you can see in theory the biomedical reasoning behind it, but actually the reality is that, policies like that from donors are actually exacerbating the violence that they are already at risk of experiencing in the communities. And, this is, you can see at the bottom right of this slide, it says, do no harm. And this is why what we're trying to do, bringing back these basic values, basic principles, basic first steps of connecting. It's not just about girls, it's not just about boys, it's not just about any individuals, it's about the connectivity between us all, what makes us tick. So, yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. Is there any more questions from the room? So I just have, we just have 15 minutes left, so any last questions, please put them in the chat box. I just have a couple of questions or points to make. In your article, which is excellent, you raised issues around two things of interest to us, particularly in the Trust Fund, which is core funding for women's organisations. And we have, over the last year, increased the percentage that we allow for allocation of core funding for women's organisations. So I wondered what lessons you can share and what message you would share on that, and your focus on funding feminist and women's organisations. And then the second question for me is around research and evaluation. So another thing raised in your article is, obviously, a lot of your methodologies were rigorously evaluated through RCTs, which enabled you to have this profile, and some people want to replicate. But obviously, that's out of reach of a lot of projects and a lot of organisations. So what messages would you have now in terms of making sure that we can evaluate and gather evidence, but not necessarily through RCTs? Thank you.
Great, thanks for that. So, anyone within CUSP who wants to take the question around funding and core funding to women's organizations? Okay, I'll start that one. And then you guys.
Tina.
Oh, Tina, great. Okay, go for it, Tina.
Okay, so I think the bit of core funding to women's rights organization is very, very essential. In that, a very important part of the success is about the capacity of the organization to be able to do this work well. And that means they have to have staff who are competent, grounded onto these social justice issues, and they are also feeling supported that they can stay. And it's about retaining very activist or feminist staff here. Now, if there's no core funding, that means there's only funding maybe for a project staff, 100%, where you might find there's only one. And it's a disservice to this given organization because other important departments like finance is not fully funded, and yet the donors want transparency and accountability of their funds, and therefore you cannot employ very unqualified staff. And then again, if there's core funding, there will be more focus onto programming as opposed to, every time you're looking for $10,000 here or $20,000 here, you're wasting a lot of time into looking for resources to do the programming well. So the core funding helps to have more longer programming that is not interrupted. And it's also about retaining competent staff and really skilled people, and also attracting skilled people who are not coming to give voluntary work. Just a quick one about this. Without the core funding, again, funding is falling into the trap of causing inequalities because there is an assumption that women's rights work is for volunteers. And they expect very many people to just do work without remuneration, which is really not fair to the programmers, and it then tends to become more exploitative in some ways. That's why we are really calling for core funding for effective programming, to have enough for programming, enough for staff, and also for the learning, monitoring, and evaluations.
Thanks so much, Tina. And if I can just add a little bit to that, I think one of the things we talk a lot about in CUSP is that, originally all of us developed these methodologies not to sort of gain immediate sort of specific results, but to really improve the quality of lives for women and girls. And that requires social change. And, all of us at CUSP really, I think I can speak for everyone, we've talked about this a lot, we would really love to see a shift back toward more movement-based social justice, social change work, which is not really aligned with project implementation. So you see groups like Sedivip, like Beyond Borders that Sarah was talking about, like CREW that Wangeshi's talking about. Those are organizations that are rooted in communities, and they've been doing this work for decades in some cases. And that means that a civil society can be developed and fostered. And so it allows not just maybe for, better results on reproductive health and violence against women reduction, but actually it builds a different kind of civil society and populace that is politicized. And that has knock-on effects on a whole range of other development issues and social justice issues. And when we reduce organizations to what we often call right implementing partners, that means they don't have the autonomy for their own vision to be able to set forth what they think is needed for justice and fairness and equality and rights in their own communities. And it's in fact disabling civil society to rely so much on an implementing partner model. We really need these organizations, feminist and women's organizations, who've been here for the long haul and who are really struggling now to even remain in existence because of this new model. But really, if we think about the detrimental effects that we would lose and what we would lose if we didn't have a strong civil society, the effects are much more than what a project results framework could be impacted on. So Diane, I'm going to reach out to you around the RCT question, and what about evidence, and when groups can't provide, can't create and include such intense research into their projects, what implications and what guidance and advice would we have for them?
So I think part of our work together has been to think more deeply about monitoring and evaluation when you have a model of social change that is not static, which an RCT demands in many ways. And so how do you begin to think about what you keep track of? And for all of us, really, how do we work with the community to monitor and eventually evaluate the changes that they want to make in their communities? And so the sort of pressure to reduce your work to visible, observed measurements that can be tracked over time, I think restricts. It's not that you can't do that in some cases, but it's restrictive. And so one of the things that for example, in Tostan, we're doing with monitoring and evaluation is really trying to include the voices of the community as they themselves describe the change that the community is going through, both their own thinking and what they think about what other people are thinking, as that's really central to social norms change. So I think this is a whole new area. I think a lot of people are beginning to look at this in terms of new models, quasi-experimental designs, participatory research, citizen science. All of these are now getting careful look because we're really trying to look at systems change. Alice, I think you wanted to add.
Thanks so much, Diane. Leah has a brief point, and then we'll move to you, Alice.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Gemma, for reading the article and having very specific questions for us on this. I also just wanted to point out that RCDs often replicate the very systems that we're trying to dismantle, because they're often done through Global North institutions, going into communities and kind of extracting some of that research. And I think that research should be done through Global South institutions and within, not even just giving voice to the communities, but led by the communities themselves, rather than just recreating this hierarchy of who has the money, who has the access to RCTs, and understanding, as Diane mentioned, there are many other ways to evaluate social norms change, but we should also be thinking critically about not reinforcing these same dynamics that we constantly talk about trying to dismantle through our programming, and that should also be included in the research and evaluation that we do.
Thanks, Leah. Over to you, Alice.
Thank you. So it's just leading on really from what Diane and Leah said, and just to draw your attention, in our SVRI policy brief from September 2017, we first used something called the change matrix, which a group of us working, commissioned by UNAIDS, used in a program called the Alive framework, which is really saying exactly what Diane and Leah said, that really we need to involve community members themselves, those most affected by an issue, in this case women experiencing violence, as participators in the whole design, development, monitoring and evaluation of a program. And I can put the link in the chat. And basically what this is really saying is, as Leah says, RCTs, sure, they have their place, but they can only tell us what. They can't tell us how or why, and they can't contribute to that real insight based on lived experience. And the importance of making sure then that those most affected by an issue have their own indicators on the table, that they're being measured also, is so key. And this is really important work and has made such a difference to, for instance, women living with disabilities in Botswana, who have made use of this approach, this Alive framework, to bring their issues to the attention of the national government in Botswana, and is really changing policy and practice there amongst government and also amongst NGOs in opening up how their issues are addressed and how services are delivered, actually making services accessible for the first time. So I think there's a really huge issue facing us all around the whole power and ethics and the way in which RCTs and research agenda in general has been driven by the global north, and there really needs to be a rectification of that.
Thanks, Alice. Gemma, I'll hand over to you.
Great, that was very, very helpful. So we're coming up to the end, sadly. I'm sure there'd be many more questions and discussion points. So just see any last points in the chat or any last comments, let us know. I'd say this has been extremely useful. Thank you. For us, for the Trust Fund, just this page on the screen now with the critical questions is so useful for us, as now we're coming up, as I said, we will be shortlisting applications for next year. So the efforts that you've put in together is so helpful to us as grant makers and to donors. And then knowing that you're there, people can contact you. Thank you for all your efforts. And this is a very important conversation that we will continue. So I very much look forward to further conversations on this. So just checking if there's any last questions in the room? No, so after this we will send on behalf of CUSP, we will send the video for this presentation and all the documents that were mentioned. And we'll keep you updated, CUSP, on how we're implementing this ourselves and how we'll use this hopefully checklist to review our applications. And we continue to look forward to working with CREA and with ADD International, who we didn't get to speak to online from Cambodia, with Beyond Borders, and also Trocare, who unfortunately went online, but we are working with a number of organizations who are adapting SASA. Any final words from you, Laurie, or the CUSP members?
Just many thanks for everyone for taking the time for the call, and special thanks to you, Gemma, and the team at UNTF for creating the space. We really, really appreciate the engagement. And I think there is one, Leah will put in the chat box, there is a little form that if you would like to keep in touch with CUSP and understand, get very few, so don't worry, your inboxes will be flooded, but I think it's like at the max once a month. Just any updates on new CUSP materials or events or other things, discussions that we're having. If you'd like to be part of that, we'll send you the link as well. But thanks so much, everybody. We really appreciate the time.
Thank you. Thank you to Diane, to Tina, to Alice, to Leah, and to all of you. We really appreciate your time, and have a great week. Thank you, everyone. Bye.